Well, hello, and welcome to Connections Online 2024, a discussion and a tribute to Peter Perla, Dr. Peter Perla, and on the art and science of wargaming. And so what I'd like to do, I'm Ed McGrady. I was a friend of Peter's. I also worked with him, and I was his boss at one time. So what we thought we'd do is just go over, I talk a little bit about Peter, and then we'd kind of go around alphabetically, starting with Matt, and talk a little bit about both Peter as well as his contribution to the discussion about art and science in wargaming. And that's still a topic that is discussed a lot, and it's a topic that raises everybody's hackles every now and then, because of the question of is wargaming a science or is wargaming an art? And of course, everybody probably knows where I come down on this. But nonetheless, we'll have a little discussion, and then afterwards we'll take questions or we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves about both Peter and remembering Peter, as well as the art and science of wargaming. Well, to start off, I just thought I'd introduce Dr. Peter Perla. He was an analyst, and I think that was the best way to describe him, because most of his career he participated as an operations analyst. He spent over 30 years at the place called the Center for Naval Analyses, CNA, of which I and several other people here are affiliated with, or have been affiliated with. CNA is the Navy's think tank. It's a sister institution to the other federally funded research and development companies, RAND, IDA, MITRE. And Peter spent his entire career there, and he spent his entire career there doing analysis on different naval problems. And I always say, I think the thing he was most proud of, and certainly the thing he talked the most fondly about, is his work on doing mathematics of anti-submarine warfare. Because at his heart, Peter was a statistician. He was a trained statistician. He got his Ph.D. from Carnegie Mellon, and his thesis was on the Lanchester equation. So he was both a wargamer and he was a statistician, which made him both incredibly smart and as well as incredibly obnoxious. To combine statistician with wargamer is quite an achievement in terms of obstreperousness. And so I met him at CNA. I worked with him for almost 30 years at CNA. And coming around in the 1980s, 1990s, he started attending war games at the Naval War College. And he was a war gamer, right? So he's a war gamer getting to attend war games and doing analysis of war games. And that's what sort of generated his writing his book, The Art of Wargaming. And I think that book is what really was his biggest contribution to the field. And within that book, I think the biggest contribution, in my opinion, is the title. It took wargaming out of the modeling and simulation community and put it in a separate area of work and a separate kind of thing that we do that has more to do with art than it necessarily has to do with modeling and simulation. And because art is about talking about people. So I did a video for Connections UK on what's Peter's biggest contribution, and that was what I thought Peter's biggest contribution was. But in addition to that, he was really also very interested in interactive learning and interactive presentation of research results. Before it was even popular to do things like YouTube and that sort of stuff, he was already thinking about how to do videos and other kinds of production techniques to get analysis across to sponsors. Chris worked with him on a lot of those things. And wargaming was a component of how to get things across to sponsors. He was also quite the mentor to a lot of people. He held court at lunch all the time. I first met him when he was going to lunch at the place downstairs from CNA, which was a Cajun place, which has since gone out of business. Many of the places we went have since gone out of business. But nonetheless, Peter was well known amongst the lunch crowd, and he used that as a way to form community and as a way to mentor people. And I think part of his legacy is the art of mentoring within wargaming. And so Peter's passing was a huge surprise to everyone, especially myself, because I had literally talked to him the day before. And so that leaves us with a gap within the wargaming community. We at least wanted to honor him by talking about things. And I thought that, we could talk about Peter, but we could also talk about his contribution. And again, I think his contribution is this movement of wargaming into a professional field that is separate from a lot of the other things that we do, analysis, simulation, within DoD. Of course, it has dependencies, but it's kind of separate. So I wanted to have the panelists sort of talk a little bit about what they thought about Peter, as well as what they think about this problem of the bifurcation between art and science in wargaming, because it is a useful and very productive discussion to have within the community. So with that, I'll start with Matt Caffrey, who is the founder of Connections, overall, the Uber Connections. He is the most connected. And he is also a wargame designer, a author, a historian of wargaming. His book on wargaming is coming out in its second edition. Get yours at whatever free site he's going to distribute it from. Or maybe he's actually going to go paid this time. And we'll find it on Amazon. So over to you, Matt.
Okay, well, thank you, Ed. Ed asked me to talk a little bit about the context of Peter Perla. And he came out with his seminal book a third of a century ago. And to really understand the impact of Peter and understand the impact of his book, you have to understand a little bit about wargaming at the time. And I was absolutely right. It was modeling and simulation people were strong and getting stronger. So at the time, you would think wargaming was on a high note. It had just played a huge role in our victory in the Gulf. It had played a very large role in our victory in the Cold War, and it would remain classified for another 30 years, but wargaming played a very significant role in ensuring that the Cold War ended peacefully. And what happened next? Well, we saw in the Gulf, there were some real problems with wargaming. The estimates of blue casualties were several orders of magnitude too high. We also had some problems with Global. Global had been the premier wargame for over a decade, played a big role in our success in the Cold War. But with the departure of the Soviet Union, it kind of lost its focus. And we also had some of the wrong lessons being learned. The problems we had in the Gulf were that human factors weren't done right, that second order effects weren't done right, that the war games weren't portable enough to bring to the field easily, and people had to tap dance and stand on one foot. And yet post-Cold War, over $1 billion was spent on JSIMs and JWARs to try to get these computer models that were wrong to talk to each other. And Peter came along with this book, and he had the audacity of calling it The Art of Wargaming. And so I see Peter having three really major impacts. One is that, as Ed said, we're starting to think about wargaming as more than a science, but a science and an art. And Peter did not shy away from the science part of it. His cycle of research and other things talk about the importance of the science element. Another huge impact Peter had was that in 1990, he came to Origins when Origins was still a big thing. That's a conference for commercial gamers. And back then, you used to have the publishers show up and the principal designers and everything else. That year, Tom Clancy was a keynote speaker, and so was Peter. And he got up in front of the whole collected commercial wargaming community and said, "You guys are important. You don't know you're important, but you're important." And I used some of Peter's arguments when I talked to Colonel Warden a couple of years later and sold him on the idea of creating the Connections Conference. So I think in a very real way, and his thing about commercial people being important was that where did the technological innovations come that allowed us to rule the skies in World War II? They came from the civilian technology area because of the competition of the marketplace. And so Peter was looking for innovations from the commercial folks, not just something he did for fun, but what could he learn? And I again brought that to Colonel Warden. And so I consider him kind of the grandfather of the Connections conferences. And finally, though, I think his biggest contribution was his example that one person can make a difference.
Mhm.
If you look at his impact on the field, absolutely tremendous. So, that being his biggest contribution, I think our best way to remember him is to follow that example. One of the things I like to say, because it's true, is that freedom is not only not free, it cannot be purchased at any price. It can only be rented by each generation. This generation needs to pay the price to keep us free. And by using the art and science of wargaming, and to get to the question you want to get to later, my opinion, is it an art or a science? The answer is yes. Like architecture, the good architecture is both, good wargaming is both. Uh, we need to be the future leaders. We need to develop the tools that our leaders and our future leaders will need. We need to do that before they know they need them. Ed, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Let's move on to Stephen because his name begins with a D, and then we'll move to Betsy, and then to Chris because his name begins with a W.
Thanks, Ed. So much has already been written and said about Peter's book, The Art of Wargaming. We've just talked about it here, and no doubt more will be said. To me, however, his book is a challenge. It's a challenge to think deeply about what the book is not about, and that is the science of wargaming. Peter and I spent many years debating this subject. Is there a science of wargaming, and can wargames be used for experiments? Were two of the questions we discussed. His answer to these questions were not an emphatic no. He was more nuanced and sophisticated, as evidenced by his cycle of research, his push for repeated wargames, and the impressive statistics skills he used to implement Latin square designs of repeated distillation games for experimental purposes. He successfully integrated wargame into a framework that indeed supports scientific inquiry. And we now need to continue building on that impressive foundation and remember where that foundation came from. And it is with deep grief that the journey continues without Peter. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Over to Betsy.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to talk a little bit about what these words mean to me and how Peter has actually refined that idea for me as I've kind of grown in my career. So for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm fairly new to the Wargaming Guild career professional area, but I am not new to gaming. Since I was little, I've actually been attending World Board Gaming Championships and Historicon events with my father and my brothers. And I am confident that at some point I probably got in Peter Perla's way, though I didn't know at the time that I was in front of a legend. Actually, you know, as a little girl, I was very girly. I was into ballet, I was into glitter. And so these kinds of events didn't always have people that looked a lot like me. In fact, it drew a lot of attention. I remember one time specifically, my father and I were at a convention. At this point, I was a young adult, and he pulled out Rommel's War. And as my dad pulled out the game, he used his usual scene-setting spiel that he did for pretty much every game. He pointed at me and he said, "It's March 1941, the first year of the war in the desert. Your British commander sent to North Africa to confront this Italian expansion starting from Libya. After a few well-fought fights, the Italians looked to Germany for support. And that's who I'll be playing, Major General Erwin Rommel in his Africa Corps in Tripoli." And his spiel was much, much longer than that. I'm not going to go into it. But as we started laying down the map and putting out the pieces, a fellow gamer came up to us and was absolutely shocked that I was playing the game. He looked at my dad and he asked him, how the heck did you get her to play? And that initial shock that I was playing and the urgent need to know what my dad had possibly done to get me, to coax me into playing that game, has really stuck and resonated with me ever since. So when I look back and I think about playing new games, complex games, historical games, professional games, Euro games, what's the thing that brought me to the table? It was storytelling. And that's something that I put firmly within the bucket of art of wargaming. As a professional wargamer, the role that story playing has played in bringing people to the table and creating buy-in for that magic circle of play is no less important, especially when you consider that the majority of the people playing our games are not gamers. But on its own, storytelling isn't enough. Rigorous methods of research and analysis are needed here to create a meaningful experience that Peter Perla has called time and time again to shed light on things we have not seen before. So the presentation that he actually gave at King's College 5 years ago, I believe it was a few years ago, really, really resonated with me as I came into professional wargaming and I started hearing this battle that I didn't quite know existed. It's an art, it's a science, it's an art, it's a science. And hearing him at his presentation say, yes, it is both, was really, really important for me. I do have a background in political science, not a statistician. But when I first came into the professional wargaming world, I immediately resonated and connected to wargaming as a method, as a tool of analysis and research. And it is. Political science centers on this idea of validity, internal validity, ensuring the instrument measures what it's supposed to, external validity, where the results are meant to be generalizable, and true validity, where the results are repeatable. However, wargaming, as the father of more modern wargaming has said many, many times, it's human-centric. It's about the assumptions and beliefs that are driving the human decision cycle. Creating a rigorous method of researching the science of human assumption isn't quite yet a formula, and I think that's probably for the best. We are researching what Peter calls the phenomena of human decisions. This phenomena and the environment that we study that phenomena in, and the variables and the constants that exist within that are always in flux, which makes it pretty much impossible to replicate in a vacuum of conditions to create the political science true validity. But this is exactly why wargaming is such a great tool to use for this level of analysis, because science alone cannot solve for X. So for me, the science of wargaming is the pull. Art has pushed me to the table, if you will, reshaping my conception of the world and allowing me to suspend belief. And science is pulling me, providing rabbit holes of meaningful data that sometimes provide some explanations and often lead to more questions that can be explored with another game. The two go together and complement each other so well that here we are, X amount of years later, still finding this topic worth talking about. And to be honest, I think the surface is still being scratched, but I really do think it was Peter who pulled the veil back and showed us just how vast and rich this topic can really be. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Well, because I'm a terrible introducer and a terrible host on the panel, I did not introduce Betsy. She is an analyst and a war game designer at the Institute of Defensive Analysis. She also co-hosts. She replaced Peter actually as the co-host of Game Nation, where we discuss topics of news and wargaming as part of the Military Operations Research Society vidcast. She is also an absolutely amazingly knowledgeable gamer. She's not giving herself credit when she says she's been doing this herself since she was a kid. She is as experienced as anyone on this panel. She just doesn't look like the rest of the people on the panel. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Weuve, who is someone who has worked for Peter in his early career and has since pursued a career as an intelligence analyst. He is currently the lead war game. I'll call him the lead war game designer, the Matt Caffrey replacement at the Air Force Research Lab, AFRL. And turn it over to Chris.
Okay, so everybody forget that Ed just told you where I work because I'm currently on leave. My opinions do not represent those of my employer, any employer, past, present, or future. So just forget everything Ed just said. So that having been said, I was first introduced to Peter Perla back in the sort of mid-1990s by Sean Barnett at the Origins Gaming Convention. I knew of Peter because I had read his book, The Art of Wargaming. But at that point in my life, I was in graduate school getting a degree in national security studies when the Berlin Wall went down. And that was bad enough. That said, long term, you were going to have PhDs, BAs chasing jobs that PhDs used to get. But the thing that really sort of made me do Plan B for the 1990s was the Gulf War, which sucked all the money for new hires out of the system. DoD basically just didn't hire any entry level people for about 2 years. And so the end result of that, I was a computer geek who was still very interested in wargaming, was still hanging out with wargamers, playing wargames on a regular basis, and was really excited to be introduced to Peter Perla, who Peter was a wonderful, loving guy, but you didn't always see it on the exterior. And so, and we were interrupting him while playing a game, and so he was friendly enough, but I was interrupting him while playing a game. A few years later, I found myself working for Peter. I sort of stumbled into it as the tech crash began to happen in the late 1990s. I was one of the first people laid off when the tech world went belly up for reasons having to do with the particulars of the company I was at. And I found myself as a intro-level war gamer at the Center for Naval Analysis. And so that was in 1999. And so when I'm honored to be able to talk about Peter in this context, and I decided that what I was going to do was look at some of his publications, because Peter published a lot. He was both a doer and a publisher, right? He executed war games, he designed war games. We worked on projects together, but he also thought that it was important to publish and present, and so he did a lot of that. So I'm going to look at 4 publications of Peter that covered almost exactly a 30-year time period. The first one is his 1986 paper, War Game Design, Development, and Play, which is an internal document that he did for CNA. The second is the 1990, The Art of Wargaming. That's the one I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on because everybody in this call has read this book. Everybody in the audience has read this book. And if you haven't, shame on you, you need to go read this book. The third is his 2008 paper, So a Wargamer and a Black Swan Walk into a Bar. And finally, his 2016 short paper, Improving Wargaming is Worthwhile and Smart. So going back to, I am specifically not going to include his artist, architect, and I forget the third one, Ed. What's the third one? Artist, architect.
Analyst. I'll talk about those, Chris.
How can I forget? I specifically decided not to include in this anything that he wrote with Ed, because Ed is here and Ed can speak to Ed's publications better than I can. So I'm going to let Ed speak to Ed's publication. Okay, so going through this, and there's places where I'm going to use Peter's own words here. I'm going to quote from his stuff. So that first paper, 1986, War Game Design, Development, and Play, that's one he did for CNA. It was very Navy focused. It was very CNA focused. It was very OPNAV focused. I mean, it was specifically for CNA and the Navy. And in that, he outlines the elements of a war game, right? He didn't quite put it in a nice list like he did later in the book. This paper basically is a big chunk of the book, right? You can see the book in this paper when you go back and read this paper. But he talks about objectives and scenario and database and models and rules and procedure and participants, right? Those are the things that he talks about, the elements of a war game, which is everything that the designer really needs to think about. Now, I would argue there's some other things. If anybody who's read my War Game Pathologies paper know that I've expanded that list because there's other different ways where your war game can go south if you haven't taken these other things into account. But that was a very fundamental, that's the foundation of the work that I've done and that I'm known professionally for. And Peter did it back in 1986 when I was working on my undergraduate degree. He talks about the importance of the objectives in the game. He says, specifying the objectives of a game is fundamental to its design. This initial step is one in which sponsors, designers, and analysts must work together not only to identify the objectives, but also to define how and in what ways the game will meet those objectives. Note, sponsors, designers, and analysts. Peter was an analyst at heart, and he understood that when you're doing an analytical war game, the analyst has to be there from the very beginning because they are the ones that are, in the end, are going to tell you whether your game was a success or not. He talks about the importance of defining what the sponsor needs. He says, Thus, the fundamental questions the game designer must ask and answer are, what does the sponsor want to learn from the players? What does the sponsor want to say to the players? Who are the players that will be involved or that need to be involved, and what are their interests and concerns? How can the sponsors and players' goals best be linked? In particular, what information must the game provide, and how can it be structured to do so? So it's all about figuring out the sponsor's need and figuring out how that communication takes place. That communication part, that this idea that war game is a form of communication, is very fundamental, and it continues to come up in Peter's work over the course of the next 30 years, right? You see, anybody who's familiar with his work sees the fundamental themes that keep coming to the forefront. Peter changed the way he phrased it over time. He would emphasize some things versus others. He expanded on points, but the very fundamentals of his work was there from the very beginning, or at least close to the very beginning back here in 1986. The war game as a form of communication. He says, in any case, the goal of a war game design is to facilitate communications. The structure of the game, consciously or unconsciously, sends the sponsor's concerns and messages to the players through the medium of the designer's interpretation of the game's objectives and means of achieving them. Think about that sentence. Let that sentence just sort of roll over to you with the implications of that sentence. Then he says, the play of the game in turn transmits the player's concerns, interpretations, questions, and insights back to the sponsor, either directly or through the medium of game analysis. So you need analysis to really get to all that point, but there's this experiential element too. It's not just the analysis, it's also the experiential element. But he also emphasizes in this original paper that war games are not analysis. He is an analyst, he is a war game designer, he is a war game advocate, but war games in and of themselves are not analysis. War games are a way of generating data for analysis. And Peter was saying that back in 1986. There's a lot of people that are in the profession who need to learn that lesson. So next, in 1990, 4 years later, almost exactly 4 years later, the publication date of that first one was February 1986. The publication of Art of Wargaming is January 1st, 1990. So just about 4 years later, he's taken that paper, he's sort of worked it out and turned it into a full-up book that expands that section that the paper is based on. The paper's like, if I remember correctly, it's like 50 pages. He expands that part into the first part of the book, and then in the second part of the book, he does a lot of history stuff about the current state of professional wargaming in the U.S. Department of Defense at the time. So it's very much a product of its time. In fact, if you understand the history going on back there, you can see the places where when he's talking about analysis and sort of contrasting wargaming with stuff, he's talking about, I think, about very specific things that are going on in OpNav and DoD at the time. He's not just, he's using, when he says analysis in that phrase, when he's differentiating it from analysis, he's talking about something very specific, but that doesn't mean that analysis is not important. And he talks in the book about how the type of analysis that you get from war games is closer to the type of analysis you get when you're doing history, right? So it's historical analysis with an artificial history. I wish Peter were here so I could tell him the phrase that I've started using at work, which is pseudo-empirical data. So war games generate pseudo-empirical data. It's not empirical because it's not real, but it's pseudo-empirical in that it has the elements of reality. If you do the game right, it has enough of the elements of reality that you can do an analysis on it and you can learn things from it. And in that book, he included an appendix on questions for war game analysis. You should anybody who doesn't have a copy of that appendix available in their wallet at all times so they can read it wherever they are, right? If you got 30 seconds available, you should pull out the appendix for war game analysis and reread it because it's that useful for those of us in the field. So in 2008, Peter wrote an article called "So a Wargamer and a Black Swan Walk into a Bar." And this was the written up version of a presentation he had done a couple of times before then. And he talks about wargaming as a way of preparing for the unknown. Now note, it does this in two ways. First of all, it does it by uncovering the unknown, which is entirely valid, right? You can discover stuff in a war game that you didn't know previously, right? You can uncover the unknown, but that's not really a black swan anymore. Maybe it was at the time, but now once you've figured it out, it's no longer a black swan, right? It's now something that's known and you can plan for. So hopefully it decreases the number of black swans that are available, right? And the ones that are truly unknowable, it makes you more resilient. It better prepares you for dealing with the unknown, right? Because if you go back to all the interwar wargaming that took place in Newport, you look at what Nimitz had to say about the wargaming in Newport after the war. It was all about throwing fastballs at naval officers and seeing if they could hit them, right? And throwing them lots of different pitches and seeing if they can hit them. And that's what wargaming is really good at. And that's one of the things he talks about here, is that it prepares you for the unknown by throwing stuff at you and forcing you to react to it. It's very experiential in that regard. So the final article that I want to talk about is his 2016 article, Improving Wargaming is Worthwhile and Smart. Now, those of you who work for the Navy, that's a really weird title. It's kind of a dumb title. And therefore, you can correctly predict that it was an article in the U.S. Naval Institute press proceedings, right? Because they write titles like that for articles. I'm sure Peter did not write that title. Nonetheless, it's a nice little editorial type article where he talks about, once again, wargaming is a tool distinct from analysis, unquote. And he also talks about something that he had been talking about in various things over the years, but I haven't mentioned yet, which is the idea that the game takes place in the minds of the players. That everything else, the map, everything else is just a way of getting stuff into the mind of the players so that they can play the game. He says, real wargaming is not about the unverifiable quantification of computer models, nor the insubstantial pontification of subject matter experts prognosticating about an unpredictable future. Real wargaming is about the conflict of human wills confronting each other in a dynamic decision-making and story-living environment. There is a place for technology in supporting that clash of wills, but electrons are not always the most useful technology to apply. We wargamers have understood this from the earliest days of chess and Go, from the von Reiswitz Kriegspiel and the Naval War College interwar gaming program. The instrumentality is not the game. The game takes place in the minds of the players, human players intensely seeking ways to beat the brains out of their opponents across the table or in the other room. It is that human dynamic and the competition, conversation, and contemplation it creates that is our most powerful and promising source of inspiration and innovation. Yeah. So there's a quote from this article that I think is a fitting place for me to end. Ultimately, we must remember and truly believe that wargaming matters. Wargaming entertains, it stirs the imagination. Wargaming challenges, it sharpens intellects. Wargaming creates synthetic experience, it enlightens leaders. And most importantly, used correctly, wargaming saves money and lives. This is the legacy of Peter Perla.
Well, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. Peter really worked on that last statement you said, and he really he used it quite frequently to conclude his presentation. So it's a good reminder of what Peter would have said had he been here. Okay, well, thank you. I have a few things to say along these lines as well. First of all, as a way to introduce myself, I will say I was the devil on Peter Perla's shoulder, telling him that wargaming was an art and professional gaming was an art, as opposed to the angels of the modeling and simulation and scientific and analytical communities who were constantly pulling him in the other directions. And if you knew how fervent and faithful a Catholic he was, and you knew me, the devil analogy is probably about right. And so I throughout the course of our collaboration, particularly in the later years, I was pulling Peter in the direction of the devil. And I think it did influence him coming back to dead center on seeing wargaming as both an art and a science. I think there's two Stephen Downes Martin problems that we're talking about here. One is, what are we talking about when we say wargaming? A lot of times I like to use the term professional gaming because I am not talking about just force-on-force gaming. Peter and myself developed lots of games that had nothing to do with force-on-force gaming. Peter did a very large game for the New York Hospital Association, for example. I've done games on prevention of sexual assault. Those do not involve force-on-force gaming. And so when you start talking modeling and simulation science, sure, if you have a relatively narrow definition of the term wargaming, you might say that it involves models and simulations and is very tied to analysis. But in general, it is tied to analysis because I continue to have to do an analysis before, during, or after, but it's something different. It's a designed art form. It's taking and understanding a problem, applying design principles, and ultimately applying your own creativity as a designer to the problem. I think the other Stephen Downes-Martin thing I would say is that what are we really doing here? What do you want? Why do you want it? Why don't you have it? You know, the 5 whys. And when you start talking about art and science of wargaming and the debate around art and science of wargaming, you have to ask yourself, why are we having this discussion? Why is there any sort of debate between the art and the science? And I think there is, and I think this is something I really regret Peter did not write up towards the end. Peter and I talked a lot about, he had a lot of opinions and analysis about the role that politics would have in the modeling and evolution of modeling and simulation, as well as wargaming from the McNamara era on forward. And really, modeling and simulation, as well as wargaming, are a way not so much to do science and find out what the answer is, but rather for the services to talk to each other in an environment where there's a lot of political charge about various trade-offs between services, trade-offs between weapon systems, trade-offs between buying decisions and other kinds of decisions. It's a way for the services to talk to each other in an organized sort of combat environment. It's like you got some rules, you got some guidelines, you got some boundaries, and therefore you can have that discussion without everybody immediately going to nuclear warfare or immediately starting to criticize your underlying assumptions about what is going on in the world. Modeling and simulation in particular, Peter felt sort of was a way to establish that ground truth, even though it wasn't truth, in the world, so that people could have a successful discussion about it. And I think this whole idea that when we talk about art and science and analysis and social science and all these other things, we're having a political discussion as much as we're having a technical discussion. It gets masqueraded as a technical discussion, but it's really a political discussion. And that's one reason I am firmly in the camp of the artist, because I think that from a political standpoint, DoD does not have enough fun. They do not play enough. They do not roll dice enough. And because of that, they screw things up all the time. And if you look at the track record, all this serious modeling and simulation approach hasn't worked too well in a lot of cases, like the invasion of Iraq. So a little bit of playfulness, professional playfulness, and controlled fun is a way to get at some of these issues that you can't get at for various optical and political reasons within the department. So I think there's really a political argument going on here, and I contend the artist part of the argument is an important part of the argument to have. But you know, when I was dealing with Peter on this, I was pulling him in the artist direction. Other people were pulling him in the analyst/scientist direction. Peter sort of tried to synthesize this, and I think he did a really good job. Chris alluded to this before. Really good job of trying to synthesize this as different types of game designer. And most of what I'm talking about here is not game players, game designers. There's the artist, there's the analyst, and then there's the architect. That was Peter's sort of trinity of types of game designers. And I think, first of all, they were based on actual people. Needless to say, I'm the artist. A guy named Mike Markowitz, who many of you may be familiar with, who used to work at CNAS, was a colleague of Chris's, is the analyst, because he takes a very analytical approach and a very numbers approach to game design. And then Peter had this third category, which he reserved for himself, called the architect. And I'm not sure there was any other architect has actually existed. And I always screwed it up when I tried to characterize what the architect was. Basically, as far as Peter was concerned, it was kind of the paragon of synthetic wargame design, because that described him. My feeling on the architect is that it focuses a lot on what the players are going to do in the game, as opposed to how you're going to tell a story about the game, which is kind of the artist characterization, or the kind of models and simulation data you're going to use in the game. Peter's focus was a lot on what the players are going to do. And in fact, whenever I design a game, I go to Peter and say, hey, I got this great idea. Here's it. And he would go, yeah, okay, what are they going to actually do? And I'm like, oh, yeah, I got to figure out what the players are going to actually do in the game. And that has stayed with me as an invaluable lesson, because he taught it to me more than once, that you have to ask what the players are going to do. And I think that trinity of artist, analyst, and architect are a good way to think about the characteristics of games in general. Games are architected form. They have rules. They have a place. They have pieces. They have things that players do and how players interact. That is essentially the mechanics of the game. That's the architect. So games have an architectural component to them. They also have an analytical component to them. And by that, I mean you do analysis before the game, because you're not doing a very good game if you don't know what you're doing. You do analysis during the game as the game's running to manage the players as well as adjudicate. So you're doing analysis during the game. And then after the game, of course, you do analysis on the results of the game. And so analysis matters for the game too. But ultimately, games, in my opinion, are about telling stories that engage. We had this in our paper that we wrote on looking at how games affect people, why games work. We had the story of Bill Clinton during there was a series of bioscares that went on back in the day. And during one of the bioscares, he was not really paying too much attention to biological policy, to biodefense policy. And, he's the president, he's got other stuff to do. And he was probably right. It doesn't really matter because no one uses it. So he wasn't paying much attention, but then he read The Hot Zone. And after he read The Hot Zone, it became very real to him by reading a story, a semi-fictionalized story of nonfiction, of what the potential consequences could be, what kind of decisions he might be asked to make. And then he reinvigorated the biodefense program after that. That was part of the reason he went back and made some policy decisions based on the story he heard. Likewise, the other example that I used in that paper was the impact event that occurred on Jupiter. Before the asteroids hit Jupiter and the Congress could see in their own little eyes that what happens when giant comets hit a planet, there was not much planetary defense stuff going on. But as those events showed them that it could actually happen and told them a story, they become much more amenable to funding things like planetary impacts. And now they do, about every other year, they do a game on planetary impact scenario. And they're very much into the analysis on that, the science of the orbital mechanics and when it's going to hit and all this other stuff. And the political decision making that would lead up to that, or being dealt with as that event kind of occurred. It's a very interesting game series. So I think that as you think about games, you have to think about the storytelling component, because that's a very compelling component. You have to think about the analytical component, because that's what makes games right. And you also have to think about the architecture of the games, because that's what players are going to do. And if the players don't have anything to do, you have a very bad game. And so the players are going to be very irritated. So I think that Peter tried to synthesize these various viewpoints in a way that gave us more information about how to think about games. And so I think that's where he was coming down. And it's really unfortunate that he retired early, that he sort of aged out of the process almost, and wasn't able to get a lot of these other ideas down into his papers and into his writing. Because one of the things about Peter that has not been mentioned at all, and that I will mention here, is that Peter was an extraordinary writer. He was extremely good at being very, very crystal clear in his writing. And he would go over and over and over it to make sure that his words were right. And that's another thing I take away from Peter, is that his care that he put into his writing and his clarity of his writing was sort of unparalleled. So he was a statistician who could write and design war games. So he was a freaking unicorn. And that's one reason we're honoring him here. He really was a unicorn. So So that's my comments. With that, I will open it up to, do we have any questions, Merle, or should I start harassing the panelists?
You were going to have us tell Peter stories too.
I was not going to do that. Someone else suggested we tell Peter stories. So if you want to tell Peter stories, go ahead and tell Peter stories.
So, Stephen, do you have any Peter stories? It helps if you unmute, Stephen.
Need to unmute.
Still muted. Okay.
While I find the unmute button. Thank you. So I first met Peter at a Moore's Future Wargaming Developments workshop in Newport in late 1989, which was before his book was published. I didn't know Peter, and Peter didn't know me, and I'd come to wargaming basically out of the simulation world. Now, at that meeting, I'm not going to allocate credit between Peter and me for what happened during that workshop.
It was Stephen.
Suffice it to say that we introduced the concept of using pigeon brains, carefully removed, either the head or the brain itself, embedded into missile warheads. They didn't have to stay alive for very long. And, all the technology was there. You've got this great visual cortex. It can control the missile fly out and or any sort of other AI related robot. And we both sort of triggered this off and carefully not looked at each other as we went down this route because we didn't want to burst out laughing. Basically, we were sort of bored with the usual vanilla obviousness of everything that was being suggested. We argued that their sort of great visual processing power was why we should be doing this and that it was possible. And we almost got the idea written up in the final report, but Moore's for some reason balked at the final editing process. Anyway, he and I remain friends and colleagues ever since. After that meeting, we just got back in touch and stayed in touch and never mentioned pigeons again. We did occasionally mention pigeon brains as a code for some bizarre and outre idea we were having in the next sort of 30 years. There you go. He had an amazing sense of humor.
Which, okay, I'll tell a story. Chris has got me. Okay, I'll tell a story because of the sense of humor. He had to have a sense of humor in dealing with me. Torturing Peter was one of our hobbies at CNA. There was a lot of various ways to do such. One of which is that Peter was very much a pack rat. He had an enormous amount of stuff. In fact, one of my running jokes was that I would actually know a way to kill somebody and get away with it, which is to order $5,000 worth of games and have them delivered to his house, whereupon his wife would kill him because his house was already packed full of games, as I might admit my house is as well. But along those lines, Peter's office was one of his repositories for his stuff, books, games, papers, and it was literally overflowing. There was like a little path that he could get. We had private offices at CNA. He had a little path he could get from his door to his desk. But that was about it. And he would sit on this throne of papers all around him with books and such, and hold court. And so myself, and if we were managers at the time, I was managing the Chem Bio team at the time. A couple of us managers who were friends decided we had papers and stuff in our offices we need to clean up. So what we would do is we'd start sneaking our papers into Peter's office over and over and over again over the course of time to see how long it would take before he noticed. Unfortunately, it was not much of a joke because he never noticed, and we had to tell him in order for it to be a joke, which he did not find to be funny at all. But we pretty much got it really, really stuffed with stuff before we had to tell him. So the other thing that torturing Peter along those lines was I thought was simply hilarious was Peter was running a game on Sudan. I think it was Sudan for somebody. And it was a sort of a round the table game, and he was doing stuff. And Yuna Wong, she kept showing up. And I think she was part of the game or something. But she kept showing up with a bunch of other people taking notes. And then I realized what she was doing. She was not studying the game. She was studying Peter. And so I thought it was hilarious that Peter was actually the human subject of a social science experiment. I don't think would characterize it that way, but nonetheless, I thought it was hilarious that they were actually studying Peter's game control process and such. So that's not much of a story, but it was my story. So.
That actually leads me to tell my story because it bleeds in from Una Wong. So when I first wanted to get into professional wargaming, I met with Dr. Wong, and she was like, hey, if you ever want to sound like what you're talking about, drop a Peter Perla quote and everyone will think you're really cool. And I met Ed, and I was like, how do I get into this? And he pretty much said, just show up. And I've been annoying him ever since. And then I met Sebastian Bay, and he said, you want to be a gamer, make a game. And I made a game, and I actually took leave from the day job I was working at to go to CNA to play test it. And right before I walked in, Sebastian said, oh, by the way, Peter Perla is playtesting your game. And my heart sank. I was not prepared. I was so shocked and embarrassed. And he was so kind. He was so cordial. He sat there. He gave me his full attention. I could have been, a PhD with 20 years of wargaming experience. And he gave me just as much as respect and attention as he did anybody else. And it meant the world to me. And then, the first game I ever made and the first thing I ever published in the wargaming community, which was about the design process for making my microgame Turning Tides, I got to say on that Peter Perla playtested my game. And that gave me, and it gave the game, and it gave that entire experience so much clout. And so I know that after the grave, he is still purchasing games by accident, but unbeknownst to him, he's also paving my way as a professional wargamer because I get to say that I had that experience. And people are impressed when they hear that. And I'm very, very grateful for his time and for the attention and respect that he paid me, not knowing who I was. And that's just such a cool experience. I'll never forget that.
Well, speaking of playing games with Peter, I played more than one game with Peter. And the problem I always had with playing games with Peter is the minute I would get a successful strategy, which was difficult against Peter, but not impossible. The minute I would get a successful strategy, he would pull out the rule book and start thumbing through the rule book and eventually find some reason why my cunning plan was not going to work because it was against the rules. And so I always accused him of making up rules in order to thwart my potential success in games. But yeah.
So I'm thinking of I'm trying to remember. It must have been at PresCon right before the pandemic hit, because I remember talking with Ed at PresCon, and he said, "Oh yeah, there's this new virus, and we're all going to we're all a month from now, we're all going to be locked in our houses." Basically, is what he said. But we played a game called Secret Hitler, and if you've ever played it, it's for those who haven't played it, it's like Werewolf, like that game where one character is secretly Hitler and you don't know which character it is, except it was Peter. And Ed had figured out it was Peter, and Ed was very vocal about the fact that it was Peter, and nobody was believing Ed that it was Peter, despite the fact that it was Peter. And that was actually just, in a lot of ways, that was just like watching Ed and Peter all the time, right? There was a lot to be said for that, as in terms of watching Ed and Peter all the time. Let's see, another quick little story. We would play games when I was on the game design team with that Peter ran at CNA. We would play games on Friday afternoons, and it was Peter and Al Nofi and Mike Markowitz and I were the team. And then Ed would sometimes join us, and we do it every other Friday afternoon. So it was a 2-week pay period. So if you had enough hours and you could take Friday afternoon off, we would sit down and play a game in one of the conference rooms. And frequently what would happen, if the game was appropriate for this, frequently what would happen is immediately upon completion of the game, or sometimes even before we completed it, we'd start designing the CNA version of the game. So somewhere in those piles of paper, there is a piece of paper that has every card in the game Guillotine with the name of a real life CNA employee next to every card.
We won't talk about Peter's HR problems with issues with HR.
So On a more serious note, there's a game that Peter did that is still one that just keeps coming up. I mean, I keep getting references to it, and it's still, I believe, at the Naval War College. It was at least part of the game design course up there, and that was his Scud Hunt game. And so Scud Hunt came about because we had a contract with DARPA, and the DARPA manager had moved on, and everybody agreed at both DARPA and at CNA that it was easier to come up with a new project than it was for CNA to give the money back. And so we came up with a new project to design a game that we would then instrument and watch how the players would cooperate. And did I mention the players were distributed? So we designed a distributed war game as part of an experiment. It was a very simple, you're looking for scuds in the desert. The desert consisted of a 5x5 grid, and you had various assets that could do things, and it was a cartoon game. It was a very simple game.
A distillation.
It was a very simple distillation, and it was, and the idea is that we had different ways that players could communicate, either through a voice channel, a text channel, a visualization channel where they'd put on the map what they thought, all three, and then we also did one where they didn't communicate at all. You had 4 players that were the asset managers that controlled the various assets, and we scored whether they were able to accurately predict where the scud was. So if the right way to think about this is that it was kind of Minesweeper-ish, except you had multiple different assets and you're trying to predict where all where the scuds are. You knew that there was a certain number of scuds and you're trying to predict where they are. And then we recruited a bunch of teams, had them play the game, and then went through and did the analysis on it. So it was a very, very interesting idea. Because there was a lot of theoretical work that said, for distributed teams, we think the right answer is to get everybody together in one room so they can get to know each other. But nobody had any actual real data on how distributed teams work, because this was like 2003. And this idea that you're going to have this distributed workplace was a very, very new idea at the time, and nobody had any real data. And so this was like one of the very first attempts to actually get real data. And this study is still cited 20 years later. Mm-hmm. And incidentally, I was at the War College at the time. I decided to take the War College War Game Design course because I was getting the War College degree, and they wanted me to be a professor teaching the course. And I said, no, I'd rather take it because then I can get the credit as an elective. And I get the syllabus, and I see that the very first thing is like, wow, the Scud Hunt report's on this. This is great. And then the second thing I thought was, this is horrible, because I hadn't actually read the final report. I had done some inputs to it. I had been one of the game controllers. I had done all that other stuff, but I hadn't actually read the report, because when Peter was doing all the stats and writing the final report, I was off on an aircraft carrier someplace. And so I had to go home that night, flush everything I was planning on doing so I could read the report, so that if I went to class the next day and I got asked about it, I could speak authoritatively about something where I was one of the authors.
Well, this isn't so much a good story as it's another dimension that we've kind of talked around the edges, and that's the contributions Peter has made to really expand and develop and establish a wargaming community. And I think the first thing he did in that area is the old SPI wakes. And since I live in Ohio and they took place in DC, I got to attend a grand total of 1. But they brought together people of interest in wargaming, not only around the DC area, but from people closer than Ohio. And you would have people like Mark Herman and all the other folks there at CNA for these things, and went on for years and years and years. Then the other thing is that Peter was very helpful in not only providing arguments that I would later use for starting Connections US, but he was very helpful in starting connections in other countries too. And I can still remember Stephen Downs Martin, myself, Phil Sabin, around the kitchen table, playing war games, talking about wargamings during Connections UK. So he helped not only establish ties within the United States, but the international wargaming community.
He also supported Connections a lot by coming to some of the very earliest Connections. I can remember working, coming with him along with Mike Markowitz to try to get him to the Connections conference, because he didn't travel all that much, to get him to the Connections conference. And he really, really liked those, and he enjoyed coming to Montgomery back then.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that sort of struck me is the rather counterintuitive interactions that have to take place between people on a war game development team as a result of Peter's clear explication of what war games are and how they're designed and how they're played and why they're successful and so on. In a lot of war game design teams, the war game development team, the war game designer and the war game analyst are different people. And two things occur. One is when you pay attention to Peter, you realize that the designer and the analyst have to work very closely together. The war game is driven by the objectives from the sponsor, and analysis decides how well or badly those objectives were achieved. And a consequence of that I've seen occur to the surprise of senior officers is the war game designer, the war game analyst has veto power over the design. If you cannot analyze properly to the war game sponsor's objectives, the design is irrelevant. It isn't actually designed for purpose. And I've seen this happen several times where the analyst vetoes the design and the boss of both is sort of shocked, horrified, and surprised. And yet that's how it must be.
Well,
so Peter introduced these concepts, laid them out clearly, and you had to pay attention to them. You couldn't just run on your intuition of hierarchy or whatever. You had to actually pay attention.
Well, in my opinion, that's a very dangerous thing, depending on how capable the analyst is that gets that veto power compared to the designer. That's
well, okay, but so
yeah, I'm assuming competent designer and competent analyst. You can always critique any argument by saying, yeah, but the person is not competent. That is not a valid criticism.
So in a perfect world, it never gets to that point, right? Because I always talk about the analyst having a veto authority, and the analyst does have to have a veto authority. If you don't trust your lead analyst and you're doing an analytical game, then you've got bigger problems, right? But it should never get to the point where you have to do veto authority stuff, because the way it should work is if the analyst is invited to all the meetings and is part of all the decision-making process and makes his needs known his or her needs known at the very beginning of the process. I mean, the analyst needs to be part of the war game design team from the very beginning. The lead analyst is a core member of that team. And so it should never get to the point where the analyst has to throw the flag down, because it should be a cooperative course correction process all the way along. Now, when it's not, and there are times where it isn't,
I've seen
you've got bigger problems. But if it's being done right, like when I was at the Naval War College, doing the Strategic Foundations game, which was this really cool meta game. It was 5 different events that took place over 5 weeks. We did 5 1 week events over the course of about 3 months, and they tied together. And if you only went to one, you thought you went to a workshop. If you went to more than one, you realized that each workshop was a move in a game. And we didn't hide that fact, but we also didn't advertise it. Global, I was the lead analyst for Global 2008. Pete Pellegrino was the lead designer. Don Marin at the War College was the game lead for it. And so we all worked together to make it happen. I'm the guy, as the lead analyst, I'm the guy who came up with the core mechanism that we use, because we were having a hard time wrapping our arms around it. It was a weird for a global. I'm the guy who said, why don't we, and Stephen was part of this too, although he didn't know it, because Stephen had introduced us all to something called the language processing method. And I said, Why don't we do the language processing method? We'll strip it down. So instead of being 3 hours, we'll do it in about 45 minutes. We'll strip it down. And that way we get the players to not only do the move that way, but they do the first line analytical grouping. So we made the players do the analysis for us, or at least start the analytical process for us, and didn't tell them. And it was all cooperative. You know, I didn't have to twist Don or Pete's arm on this. It's like, oh yeah, that solves the problem. And they knew where we were going, and we were all working away. And so now all three of us had read the book of Perla. You know, we're devotees of the book of Perla, and had all the merit badges and everything. And so we were able to go and do that.
So I have a question based on this.
Sure.
Why do we always keep coming? You know, the title of the book is The Art of Wargaming. Why do we always keep coming back to these sorts of subjects? The analysis, the rigor, the science, that sort of stuff. Why? I mean, I'm asking in a Stephen sort of sense.
So
why is this so important that it dominates over other topics? When given everybody's druthers to just evolve the conversation always tends to come back around to how you make things more analytical, how you make things more rigorous, as opposed to how you make other things better about the game design. So I'm just curious as to why that happens.
I have an answer.
In my view,
everybody has an answer.
It's this business of saving lives. Wargaming for national security affects how many people die. And some, you know, if you can make it as rigorous as possible, and there's the phrase, as possible. It's not necessary. It's not a science, a pure science. It's not a laboratory experiment, but we're using money and time, valuable people's time, to try and get at questions about warfare. And it behooves us to be as rigorous as possible. And those last two words are important.
But that assumes sort of what I would consider a force-on-force model for wargaming, that you're going to...
No, it doesn't assume that. I'm sorry. Anything dealing with national security involves lives, blood, and treasure. If you simply have a game about policy dealing with poverty, you're involving human lives. We know from statistics that when people become poorer, more of them die. So you've got to get the policy right. It matters.
Okay, but I think everything you said is true, Stephen, but I'm not sure that it addresses the core of the issue. Let me take a shot.
It does for me. Don't speak for me, Chris.
I'm not speaking for you. I'm speaking for me. Let me try to address this and try to synthesize this. I think my answer to your question, Ed, is twofold. The first one is that while it is always important to get the story aspect of it right, a lot of it has to deal with the objectives. It all comes back to the objectives. And for a lot of the gaming that we do, and for like pretty much everything that I did in Newport, although not everything, the experiential side of the thing, while important, was a sideshow. It wasn't the core. The core was, at the end, I've got to have data that I can analyze to provide a report to answer a question that a sponsor has had. Now, if it's a training game, it's an entirely a different thing. If it's an experiential game, it's entirely a different thing. And CNA, of course, did a really, really good example of those that occurred about a year before I showed up at CNA that I really wish I had seen, which was the shipbuilding game. Mm-hmm. The shipbuilding game, as near as I can tell, was entirely experiential. It wasn't about collecting a bunch of data. It was about taking the premise of the shipbuilding game, for those who aren't members of the particular CNA shipbuilding game cult. The goal of this shipbuilding game was that U.S. Navy shipbuilders, people that had traditionally built naval vessels, were looking to expand into the commercial realm, but they had no experience in that. The commercial realm stuff, a different set of standards, different set of customers, different set of customer concerns, et cetera, et cetera. And so this was intended to be a way to pull together shipbuilders who primarily had worked for the Navy with people who bought civilian ships, shipping companies, right? People that bought ships from shipyards. And it was to put them together in the same room and have the shipbuilders come up with stuff and show it to the shipping companies and see what they thought. And everybody came away from that game. I mean, there's videos on this game. Everybody came away from that game going, I didn't understand what the other guys did. I just didn't understand it. All the shipping companies basically said cost. And the Navy guys naval shipbuilders would say, okay, but we got these other features, so it's a better value. It's like, no. You increase the cost. We don't care about that other stuff. We only care about the cost. And that was the recurring theme. I saw that with some of the other stuff. Like there was the one where the UN official said that he had learned more about a particular problem playing the game than he had through 2 decades of study before that, right? And I can't remember which game that was, but it was another game that was always one of the success stories that people talked about at CNA. And so for that stuff, I mean, that stuff, the storytelling side of it, the experiential side really came to the forefront. On the analytical side, it's not that stuff is unimportant. It's that that's not what we were graded on directly. We're indirectly graded on it because if you don't answer the mail on player experience, on telling the story, et cetera, then you haven't met your objective. I always look at these things. I mean, if anybody who's seen my data collection and analysis plan talk, I always say that the report writer, and I'm talking specifically about analytical war games, has 3 goals, 3 things they have to do in the report: caveat the results, highlight the subtle, squash the irrationally exuberant. That first and that third part are because the story, if you've done the game right, the story gets out. But people don't understand the story. They think they understand the story because they had this experiential thing, and they'll tell people this is what happened in the game, and maybe it did from their point of view, but you need the analysis and for analytical games to say no, that's not quite what happened. And so I mean, it's so far down on the list of things is I don't even include officially the thing that you obviously have to do, which is sort of like detail what happened in the game, right? Okay, yeah, you have to talk about what happened in the game, but that's not the important thing, I don't think. In those sorts of things, you have to highlight all that other stuff. Does that answer your question, Ed?
Yeah, it kind of does. I think there's a deeper issue going on here, and that has to do with especially the American and also the military's fetishization of quantization of science, of technology, as opposed to human interactions and human decision making. If we look where we get ourselves into trouble, it's a lot of times it's not the fact the weapon systems don't work; it's we shoot them at the wrong target, or we make a mistake with respect to escalation, or whatever it is that we're doing. And those are not technical issues. They tend to be social issues. And so I think there's this, and I'm not saying Stephen's wrong. Stephen and I are both right, as Peter would say. We're just right in different ways. And so anyway, Matt, did you have
getting back to your original question? I think one reason it keeps coming up is that the right answer isn't obvious. And as Chris alluded to, the right answer varies from war game to war game. And the reason it does is that instead of as analytical as possible, I like to talk about, and I think that's one thing that Peter talks about too, is it's a question of trade-offs. You know, the war game only has so many hours to be prepared, only so many hours to be conducted. And you can put your time into getting to the third decimal point of analysis, or you can get your time, you can dedicate a certain amount of time into, are they going to be, is their morale going to break, and are they going to all desert? So when we shoot at the Iraqi tanks are empty. And you can only spend 1 minute one way or the other. And normally it's a balancing act, because you certainly don't want to leave out the numbers and the calculations and probabilities and all the rest, but you really don't want to leave out enemy morale either. And I think that's one reason why the debate will never end, because each new war game requires a different balance.
I think what we need is a new Caffrey triangle, actually, on game design between playability and realism and complexity. I can't make it into a triangle. That's my big problem. I keep coming up with some sort of pyramid, but nonetheless.
Gee, what a great idea, Ed.
Yeah.
There's a second edition coming up. And
Doesn't Peter Pellegrino have something along those lines? The playability, the fun meter, I think he called it.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of a triangle to go with Matt's triangle.
yeah.
Yeah, well, make it a three-dimensional triangle.
Or an one-dimensional triangle for those who like mathematics. Yeah.
Four-sided dice, yes.
You can always add, as any engineer would tell you, you can always add variables to get more accuracy in your model. So
I'm going to be the contrarian here. If I never hear the word realism again in association with game design, it'll be too soon. And the reason why is because it's a shitty standard. The standard should be fit for purpose, right? Realism gets treated like it's this absolute thing, right? And the problem with it is if you treat it like it's an absolute thing, next thing you're at the point where you're trying to get the fourth and fifth decimal point to the right of fourth or fifth digit to the right of the decimal point. When I'm frequently dealing with a situation where I can't convince people to do the things necessary to get the tens digit correct.
Well, but Chris,
and so fit for purpose is a much better standard, because sometimes you don't want realism, because sometimes you're doing something that's a lot closer to developmental test than something that's close to operational test. An operational test, you're testing the war plan, or the wargaming equivalent of operational test is testing the war plan, and you got to make that work. But the wargaming equivalent of developmental test is testing to destruction, right? You're testing it until it fails. So it's like the difference with the analogy I always use is an eye test, right? Have you ever gone to the eye doctor and your eye doctor said, "I've run out of increasingly tiny letters for you to look at. You won." No, you test until you fail, right? And so in a lot of the things that I see going on, you test until you fail. And so the idea is, I want there to be a failure, because as an analyst, I'm trying to figure out where the failure point is. So what I don't want is, like, if I'm, say, defending an airbase, if I'm testing defending an airbase, I don't want 10 million missiles to come in, but I also don't want 3 to come in. I want 1 missile to make it through.
Yeah, I think that when I say realism, I simply mean making sure the game works in a way that's similar to how things work in the real world. You've also
fair enough, but that's not how it gets interpreted in the outside world. Right. Yeah. In the outside world, it gets interpreted as, well, our tanks in the real world have 7 road wheels, so all the tanks in the game have to have 7 road wheels.
Right, and I think that realism has to do, for me, with how it works in the real world, as opposed to what I think you're talking about, which as an engineer I would consider accuracy and precision. Accuracy is how close are you to the actual number, and precision is how many digits do you have in your prediction, whether or not you're accurate or not. Mm-hmm. And so I think we focus a lot on precision. I don't think we focus on accuracy and realism, and that's how I tend to think about it.
And going back to the idea of storytelling games, there's a great example that from my days in Newport, which is an example, and Peter actually ended up playing in this game one time, because we did sort of a remote version of it one time. It was a game where there was a conscious decision made by the designer, who was Pete Pellegrino, to make the game as unrealistic as possible. And that's because this was a game for the Senior Enlisted Academy. So these were a bunch of non-commissioned officers who were warfare specialists, who were being asked for the first time in their career to lift their head up and think about the D, I, and the E, right? They had spent 20 years doing nothing, or 15 years doing nothing about thinking about the M, and now we needed to make them think about the D, the I, and the E. And the problem is, these are not guys that handled abstraction on the M well. So the first iteration where we tried to make things accurate, we'd get like, well, the range of the harpoon is 87 miles, and you had it as 90, and that's wrong.
Yeah, let's play history in the comments. Let's play.
It was a cartoon war game where none of the stuff in the M made it was like airplanes moved at 3 times the speed of ships, and they were both consumed by going to their destination. And it all worked out because people, they'd initially go tilt, and then we'd explain what we were doing. And at that point they'd go, okay, Roger that. And they'd press the I believe button, and they'd focus on the DI and the E. And it worked great.
Yeah, I just want to, as we conclude here, I think we've sort of reached a culmination, if not an argumentative point. I just want to circle back to this last question, which is, what role does politics, and by politics I don't mean red versus blue politics, but a rather social political environment in which we operate as game designers, what role does that play in this discussion of art versus science? If I just want to give you a chance to reconsider it, and Stephen is shaking his head vigorously. So, Stephen, what do you think?
It's money. It's money. Who can sell? Who can sell to the I mean, I'm talking national security, DoD wargaming. Who can sell to the DoD a product that they're willing to spend more money on? Is it the is it the science? Is it the art? The politics is all about money.
In lieu of an active enemy, the enemy is always the person who's trying to take your money.
Yeah.
Betsy, do you have something to contribute here? Oh, you're muted.
Mute.
Oh,
You're still muted.
Can you guys hear me now?
yes.
Yeah.
Great. I do feel like it kind of touches the conversation we were having before, and I absolutely agree. I do think it has something to do with money. I've definitely been told on projects before, and I'm not saying at my current work, but just in the opportunities that I've had with wargaming, hey, listen, we've been given a lot of money for this project. We really need to show them something precise, something intense, something cool. If they give me X amount of dollars and I bring them a report and I said, everyone had a lot of fun, I don't know if that sponsor is going to be like, great, I'm going to give you more money to do the same thing next year, right? So I have to pull in science, and I've got to pull in data and charts and tables and like all this visual graphic effect, and I got to make the game cute. And a lot of it is to show the sponsor that their money was used in a really great way, in a way that no one else could probably provide for them. So they should probably come back to us next year and give us more money to do a similar project. And it's difficult, but I do think it's part of the business. And I kind of alluded before too, a lot of these games, I feel like part of it is giving us some answers to some research questions, but then a lot of it is being like, but look at all these other questions that the game didn't answer. Give me more money and maybe I can answer some of those. And those will lead me to more questions that maybe, I can make more games for you. So it's kind of this idea of, we want to do obviously rigorous work and analysis, but we also want to create further studies, further areas of exploration. And unfortunately, a huge part of that is money. So I agree with Stephen.
Yeah, and in the next Connections conference, we're going to have a panel. I'm going to try to do a panel on building your own game company, and having some sort of differentiator, razzmatazz, or something that you're selling the sponsor is an important component of that. But yeah, and that's true for existing businesses too. So
when I do
Matt,
my data,
let's go to Matt next, and I'll end up with Chris, and then I'll have a few things to follow up and conclude.
Yeah, I think, well, you're right about money. I think it kind of goes beyond that, or that's a component, because you look at the number of people involved in modeling simulation and the budget involved in modeling simulation. Mm-hmm. They're large enough and have large enough budgets to have SESs in charge of various different things, a lot of rank within the civil service. Now, how large is the wargaming organizations, and how large are the wargame budgets, and how many SESs are in charge of wargaming shops? So from the internal DoD political competition, we're kind of in the position of the Air Corps in the 1920s, where in the senior Air Corps guy is a brigadier, and the senior guy in charge of the cavalry branch, I think, is a 3-star at the time. But I think Becky has the answer to my question before I even brought it up, and that is just doing good work over time. Wargaming will become a larger part of the pie, and we'll have more clout to try to continue that, but it rests on a foundation of providing good value with what we have.
Chris?
I always start off my wargame pathologies talk with the statement that, or maybe it's actually, come to think of it, it's actually the data collection and analysis plan talk. I always start off with the statement that a wargame is a political act, because everybody's got an agenda somewhere. And the wargame supports somebody's agenda and it's against somebody else's agenda. And that you need to, at a very fundamental level, you need to understand that as a wargame designer and a wargame analyst, that there is potentially a minefield there. The minefield may be full of glitter bombs, or it may be full of small scale nukes, but there's a minefield there, right? And so you need to know that going in. So war games always take place in a political context, right? There's somebody fighting for a budget somewhere, et cetera, et cetera. This is why it is fundamentally critical that you get the sponsor's statements correct, the sponsor's problem statement correct, and then you develop a set of objectives that come off of that you can use as the filter. The objectives should be the way you determine whether your game was successful or not, right? So if the objective says the players have to have fun, which is what happens in hobby games, then if you demonstrate the players had fun, then you've met the objective. But it's usually something more that is an unusual objective. I can't recall ever being given that, coming to the conclusion that was objective for any of the games I've done professionally. As it turns out, some of the games did turn out to be fun, but it was never part of the objective, right? Except to the degree that you need to have player engagement. Making the game fun is a good way to get player engagement. So I think, the politics of this is all very interesting. Everything always takes place in a political context, but you need to make sure that your game is sort of appropriately scoped for what you're trying to do. And sometimes you can avoid some of the politics by scoping the game appropriately and making sure that you get the objectives correct in that regard.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate. Well, I just wanted to conclude here by thanking everybody for taking an hour and a half out of their day and coming to their panel, particularly Stephen, Betsy, Matt, and Chris. And I also wanted to thank anyone who has actually watched this video to this point. You, sir, have a very keen interest in Peter Perla and the art of wargaming. And I want to say that I think the best way to remember Peter and his legacy is to continue to talk about his ideas and continue to refer to the things that he really valued, which was the analytical understanding of wargaming and understanding what it means for us as people, as professionals, and as warfighters. So I really appreciate all of you, and I appreciate connections. Here's a memorial for Peter. There is I will also say that there's a scholarship fund being set up or trying to be set up at Duquesne University. And there is a link down here in case you wanted to donate to the Peter Perla Fund at Duquesne University. So, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Ed. And thank you. I think it's Zachary, our producer.
Yes, Merle.
And Merle.
Yeah, thank you, Merle.
Thank you, Merle.
You.